Voyager 1 was never meant to be part of this story. It launched in 1977, completed its grand tour, and kept drifting into the quiet space between stars. For decades, it sent back a slow, steady stream of data. Nothing surprising, nothing unusual, just the familiar signature of a spacecraft doing exactly what it was designed to do. That's why, when technicians noticed a small but intentional change in its orientation earlier this year, it immediately raised interest. Voyager 1 doesn't turn unless it's told to, and this time nobody had issued the command. At first, the shift seemed insignificant, half a degree, barely noticeable, but the direction mattered. The probe had subtly rotated toward the projected path of 3I-ATLAS, the interstellar object discovered in July 2025. ATLAS was incoming fast on a hyperbolic trajectory that meant it was just passing through the solar system, not staying. Interstellar objects are rare, but after Oumuamua and Borisov, scientists knew what to expect. They expected randomness. They expected a body shaped by some distant star system. They expected it to behave like a comet or an asteroid, nothing more. But almost from the beginning, ATLAS felt different. Its early images showed a faint coma, but the composition didn't match typical comets. The spectral readings leaned heavily toward carbon dioxide, with very little water signature. As it drew closer to the Sun, the activity around it didn't follow the familiar patterns. Then came the anti-tail, nearly 3 million kilometers long, larger than many planets, and pointing toward the Sun instead of away from it. Natural processes can create that effect under very specific conditions, but not with the clarity and scale that ATLAS displayed. The images from multiple observatories confirmed the structure. It wasn't an artifact, it was real. Around the same time, Earth's magnetometers started registering small spikes, not dramatic, not concerning, but consistent. Their timing lined up with ATLAS's rotation period, although at the time, no one connected the two. People assumed solar noise or routine variations, but a few analysts noticed the regularity, the almost metronome-like spacing between each pulse. It didn't behave like random interference. Voyager 1 began picking up something as well. Its cosmic ray subsystem, usually one of the quietest instruments on the probe, started showing brief, repeating fluctuations. The first thought was interference or aging hardware. But the fluctuations weren't random. They came in a pattern, short, then long, then repeating after the same interval. When engineers applied smoothing algorithms to the data, the rhythm became even clearer. It was as if the probe was receiving a distant heartbeat in the static. Nothing about this was conclusive. Nothing pointed cleanly to a cause. But the timing drew attention. ATLAS was now approaching the inner solar system, and Voyager, sitting far beyond the heliopause, seemed to be responding to something. Those who tracked interstellar objects noticed something else. ATLAS wasn't just brightening. Its brightness curve showed controlled rises instead of the chaotic variability seen in natural outgassing. The curve didn't spike. It stepped. That's when the comparison between ancient alignments emerged, not because anyone expected a connection, but because the pattern was striking some of Earth's oldest structures, from Machu Picchu to Göbekli Tepe, have alignments that correspond to solstices and celestial events. In a few cases, those alignments form narrow sight lines that match the angle ATLAS entered along. It wasn't evidence of anything, but it was enough to raise eyebrows among researchers who study long-term sky patterns. The question wasn't whether ancient civilizations had predicted ATLAS. The question was whether the path ATLAS followed was a natural coincidence or part of a larger cycle. Meanwhile, Voyager 1 continued to shift. A second orientation correction appeared in the data, again without a command. This time, the turn aligned the probe even more precisely toward ATLAS's future path. Not where Atlas was, but where it would be weeks later. In the past, Voyager has occasionally drifted due to fuel residue or thruster noise, but these movements weren't drift. They were clean, deliberate adjustments. Not enough to change the mission, but enough to suggest intent. By this point, the team monitoring Voyager stopped assuming malfunction and started looking for correlations. Their models showed that the probe's orientation changes lined up with the same intervals recorded in the magnetometer spikes and the long-range observations of Atlas's brightness pulses. The three data sets, Earth-based magnetics, Voyager telemetry, and Atlas optical readings, were telling a quiet, steady story. Something rhythmic was passing through them all, still nobody wanted to jump to conclusions. The tone within NASA and other agencies remained careful. The official explanation was that Voyager's aged systems were acting unpredictably, and Atlas simply behaved like an unusual interstellar comet. But behind the scenes, analysts kept asking one question: why were the rhythms matching? Why were the signals cycling at the same intervals? And why did Voyager turn toward an object it wasn't built to track? Part of the answer, or maybe the beginning of one, came not from Earth, but from the data packets Voyager sent out shortly after its second reorientation. Buried in the telemetry was a small segment of repeating noise, not a message, not a signal, but a structure. And when it was compared to the brightness cycles observed from Atlas, the pattern was nearly identical. This didn't prove anything, but it made one thing clear. Voyager wasn't drifting randomly, it was reacting, and somewhere deep in the data, a connection was forming. Quiet, subtle, but impossible to ignore. The more analysts compared the patterns, the more the connection between Voyager 1 and 3I-ATLAS stopped looking like coincidence. The timing lined up too neatly. Every time Atlas produced a brightness pulse, Voyager's instruments seemed to echo something similar a short time later. It wasn't a perfect match, but it was close enough that the engineers decided to run historical comparisons. Surprisingly, the correlation increased over the past year. The closer Atlas came to the inner solar system, the clearer Voyager's fluctuations became. It was as if the old probe, sitting far beyond the reach of sunlight, was picking up a signal that grew slightly stronger as the interstellar object approached. Around this time, a small cluster of documents leaked from inside an agency data group. Nothing dramatic, just internal notes from analysts trying to model the repeating intervals. One label in particular caught attention: Echo Refraction 67. The name wasn't part of any public NASA terminology. It referred to a wave pattern that seemed to refract or bend through multiple media, showing up both in Voyager's magnetic data and in optical data from Atlas. The notes suggested it behaved like a self-correcting signal, one that repeated every 19.7 minutes, adjusting slightly each time to maintain integrity through interference. That kind of behavior is not something natural electromagnetic noise normally does, but the documents made no claims about origin. They simply described the pattern as unusual and consistent. Meanwhile, NASA's in-house anomaly detection AI, known informally among technicians as Serena, flagged Voyager's orientation changes again. Its algorithm categorized the movements as directed, the kind of term reserved for thruster behavior with clear purpose. Because no manual command had been sent, the system flagged it for review. This didn't imply anything extraordinary. Aging hardware sometimes fires in odd ways, but Serena also flagged the timing. It matched the brightness pulses from Atlas within a narrow margin. Even more interesting was what happened next. After Voyager's shift, Atlas's brightness pattern changed. The intervals between pulses began to drift slightly, as though the object were adjusting its behavior. The timing correlation wasn't sharp enough to suggest communication, but sharp enough to raise questions. Atlas slowed in its lateral drift shortly after Voyager's reorientation was logged. Scientists were careful not to read too much into it, but the sequence, Voyager shifts, then Atlas adjusts, was noted in multiple internal reports. At the same time, an old and mostly forgotten detail resurfaced: the golden record. Not the audio itself, but the hidden mathematical patterns encoded into its analog grooves. One of the sequences engraved onto the record is a simple count based on hydrogen transitions, meant to provide universal context. When analysts looked at the repeated pulses in Atlas's brightness fluctuations, they recognized the same spacing pattern. It wasn't identical, but it was recognizable. Prime numbers, small ratios, simple mathematical intervals, the kind designed to be understood regardless of who or what receives it. A few researchers suggested cautiously that the response pattern Voyager picked up might reflect that same mathematical structure. Not because 3I-ATLAS was decoding the golden record, but because the universe often expresses stable processes through simple ratios. Still, the pattern appearing on both sides, Voyager's end and ATLAS's end, was enough to make people look twice. Then there was the internal classification. According to a separate leak, NASA had categorized the Voyager anomaly under something called the Watcher Protocol. It's not a dramatic name. It's essentially a procedural guideline for how to manage unexplained long-term patterns in deep space data. It doesn't assume intent or danger. It simply keeps everything contained until the pattern either dissipates or becomes clear. The classification confirmed that NASA wasn't treating the correlations as random noise anymore. They were acknowledging it as a real, trackable phenomenon. Around this same period, SETI's public signal database stopped updating for a few weeks. There was no announcement, no explanation. Researchers assumed it was routine maintenance, but the timing matched the window when Atlas's pulses became most regular, whereas independent radio astronomers claimed they were asked not to share certain raw readings until further review. Nothing dramatic, just a temporary request. Still, the overlap in timing fed speculation among the scientific community. Outside the agencies, universities began contributing their own analysis. A theoretical group from Kyoto University proposed a simple but interesting model. What if Atlas was not sending signals, but responding to environmental stimuli, gravitational fields, solar radiation, or long-distance electromagnetic disturbances, and Voyager's position just happened to align with those disturbances? In that case, the correlation might be a natural resonance effect, something more like a tuning fork than a message. The object might not be interacting with the Voyager at all. Both might simply be responding to the same underlying wave structure moving through space. But then came the most puzzling detail. As Atlas moved deeper into the inner solar system, Voyager's readings didn't fade. They sharpened, and on one particular day, when both objects' projected paths lined up along the same corridor extending outward from the Sun, the pulses on both sides reached near-perfect overlap. Voyager showed its cleanest repeating signature in months. ATLAS produced its most stable brightness interval, and the Earth's magnetometers recorded one of their clearest sub-hertz fluctuations. 3 separate systems across billions of kilometers, showing synchronized behavior. No one could say what it meant. No one jumped to conclusions. But many quietly acknowledged the same thought. Voyager might have stumbled into a pattern it wasn't designed to interact with, and ATLAS might be moving through the same structure. Whatever the truth, it was becoming harder to dismiss the idea that both were responding to something larger, something connecting their trajectories in ways no one fully understood. And in the quiet discussions happening behind closed doors, a single question began circulating. Not whether ATLAS was communicating, but whether it was simply reacting to Voyager's presence, or to something Voyager activated long before anyone realized it had.